A celebration of culture or colonialism? On Australia's controversial National Day, we ask if the country is turning a blind eye to the suffering of Aboriginal people. Also on the program, India celebrates its constitution, but is it upholding its highest laws? We get the view from Indian-administered Kashmir. I'm Imran Garza, and this is The Newsmakers. Australia Day is meant to unite the nation in celebration of its culture, but each year it exposes divisions within the country, particularly around Australia's history. January 26 marks the start of European settlement. For the country's first inhabitants, it's a day of mourning that serves as a reminder that their land was stolen and that their ancestors were slaughtered by British colonists. Some sectors of society say that it's in the past and Aboriginal Australians need to move on. But Aboriginal Australians say that's hard to do when they continue to face oppression and socio-economic disadvantage. Today's Newsmaker is Australia Day, as we ask if the government should heed calls to change the date.
January 26 is Australia Day. But for many Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, it's not a reason to celebrate. Instead, it's a reminder of colonisation, the day the British claimed Australia and the start of the fight for survival of Indigenous Australians. And that's why it's also been labelled Invasion Day. The event is meant to unite the multicultural nation. And it's been celebrated officially on the same date since 1994. For many people, it is worth marking, with a day off work and new citizenship ceremonies.
That's that land-taking, flag-waving attitude. Got this new Captain Cook dance to show you how to move. How you want to raise a flag with a rifle that make us want to celebrate anything but survival. Nah.
But there's also a growing awareness about how divisive the date is. And the campaign for change has gone viral.
So let's celebrate on a different day, the most Australian day of all, the 8th of May. May 8. Mate. Sure, it might be a bit cold in May, but it's not as cold as ignoring genocide.
The government says it doesn't have any plans to change the date. Australia's road to reconciliation with its First People has been long and complicated. In 2008, the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued a national apology for a policy which saw Indigenous children removed from their families and placed into white foster care.
To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry.
But the scars of settlement and dispossession run deep. Indigenous Australians make up about 3% of the population, but they represent about 27% of the prison population. Last year, the nation was appalled when pictures emerged of a 14-year-old Aboriginal boy in youth detention, strapped to a chair and hooded. At the time, it was likened to the treatment of a Guantanamo Bay detainee. Changing the date of the National Day won't solve the underlying problems of racial inequality. But could it play a role in addressing the treatment and public attitudes towards the Indigenous community? Natalie Perhonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Sydney is Alan Clark. He's a Marrawara man and a journalist with BuzzFeed News. And in Melbourne, Dr. Kevin Donnelly. He's a senior research fellow at the Australian Catholic University and is regarded as one of the country's leading education experts. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Alan. Tell me about the protests. Were they peaceful? How'd they go?
Well, the protests were largely peaceful. Every year, Aboriginal Australians take to the streets in pretty much every major city and hold what they would call an Invasion Day protest or Survival Day protest. So largely peaceful. There was a bit of a fracas in Sydney, in what was predominantly a very peaceful protest. But at one point, a young musician decided to try and light the Australian flag on fire, and that drew about 6 police officers. It was a little bit excessive that came in and sort of wrestled him out of the crowd and took him to a nearby police station. But apart from that, the march continued on to a concert in a local park, and it was relatively peaceful, and the police have even acknowledged that as well.
Okay, Alan, tell me why you support changing the date. Why do you want to change the date?
Well, I want to change the date because, first of all, I'm Aboriginal. I grew up, in a very small outback community as part of a really amazing community. But on that day, my family and my people feel really excluded. We would like to celebrate Australia with the rest of the country. We just can't do it on a date that's so divisive. For my family, it marks the start of a lot of horrors and genocide and massacres and rapes and, really terrible stuff. And this is not ancient history. It's within the past 229 years. That's only a few generations back. And that and some of those horrific things from colonisation we're still seeing today. So we're still seeing higher rates of Indigenous people being incarcerated. We're still seeing sky-high rates of children, Aboriginal children, being removed from their families. We're still seeing poverty. We're still seeing Aboriginal children dying.
Point well made. Let's bring in Kevin Donnelly. Point well made. Kevin Donnelly, one man's independence is another man's invasion. Do you have any sympathy or empathy with that view?
Well, I do to a degree, but the reality is the reason why we were able to have demonstrations today where we live in a country, a Westminster liberal democracy, where people are allowed to disagree. We have freedom of expression, people can vote, people can live their lives without interference from government, unlike many countries to our north, like China or Vietnam or Myanmar. I mean, the reality is we are a Western liberal democratic country, and that's a great thing. And it all began with the First Fleet. The minute Governor Phillip proclaimed the colony part of the British Empire, we inherited English law, English common law, Magna Carta, and a Westminster parliamentary system that's evolved over many years. But I would argue the reason why we're able to have this debate in Australia is because of the First Fleet.
Dr. Donnelly, you say this is a liberal Westminster parliamentary democracy, and those are all great things. I wonder what you think about the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, saying anyone who wanted to move the date, quote, he said, I'm just sick of these people who every time they want to make us feel guilty about it. They don't like Christmas, they don't like Australia Day, they're just miserable, gutted people. I wish they would crawl under a rock and hide for a little bit. Does that sound like the words of a representative of this inclusive, tolerant democracy?
One of the unique characteristics of Australia is we do like to have a go. We do like to often get straight to the point. And I imagine internationally, when you look at the Trump election in America, when you look at Brexit in England, there is a sense now that a lot of people feel that political correctness has gone too far, that the pendulum has moved too far towards identity politics, about victimhood. The reality is there is a substantial Indigenous industry in Australia. All Australians are able to vote. There's a lot of charitable, welfare, philanthropic. We had the Mabo decision in Australia, where Indigenous people now have greater control over their own land. So I would argue Barnaby Joyce, part of the National Party, I'll excuse him today. I wouldn't use that expression, though.
Okay. Alan, are you convinced by any of that?
In a word, no. Well, it's a really bizarre argument to say, well, we have all of these, incredible luxuries because of the British legal system, but they're the ones that ignored a system that was in place here for hundreds of thousands of years. There was a government, there was a community system, there was a rich and thriving community. When the British came, they chose to ignore all of that. And first of all, we talk about the Mabo decision where we get control over our own lands. Well, that's an incredibly hard thing to do. But the Mabo decision, at the heart of it, basically overturned the notion of terra nullius, which was the notion that nobody owned Australia. And the British people used that because it was the only way they could claim this land under European law, was to say that it was nobody's land. So it was founded on a lie. Colonisation, as we know, is a lie in itself. And it took an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander person, Eddie Mabo, to go to the High Court and prove that there were traditional owners in this country before the British. So that's not really a victory, having to go through that system and prove a lie. So of course I can understand why a lot of younger people are coming up saying, we don't recognise the Constitution because the British never recognised our sovereign right to this country. And so, yeah, none of that sits well with me.
Kevin Donnelly, this hasn't been a thing since 1994. I mean, this is not a long-standing tradition, right? I mean, it's been officially annually celebrated since 1994. What's so wrong about making some sort of compromise, saying, okay, we're all proud to be Australians, but let's change the date so the date is not a divisive one, which many consider to be a date which symbolizes genocide, dispossession, and you said victimhood. I mean, this was real victimhood. This was not imagined victimhood. Why not a compromise to say we can build this country together looking forward, but also recognize that there were some terrible things that happened to allow that process to unfold?
Well, two things. In fact, New South Wales has always celebrated the arrival of the First Fleet, and I think Australia Day began a long time before you suggested 1994. I think it was the early 1940s. The second thing is, I don't believe that the Indigenous people ever had a government. I think that's a myth. In fact, all the research I've looked at in terms of anthropology, Australia, the colony, those early years, in fact, there were many Indigenous tribes. They were often at war with one another. When you look at their conditions, their life, often it wasn't very, frankly, it wasn't very much like we have now in terms of democratic rights, freedom of religion, respect for one another. It was a very harsh, difficult life. So I think we have to be careful about this myth that somehow it was an Eden, a utopia before European settlement. And the other point I'll finish with is that when Governor Phillip arrived, he was told strictly by the Admiralty in London to try and negotiate to not be offensive or to invade, as they say. It was a peaceful colony to begin with. That doesn't deny the fact that over years there was warfare across what is now Australia, but that occurred on both sides. And you have to understand that many Indigenous people have in fact become assimilated and are very happy to be Australian. I don't believe in this idea of everybody having their own identity, Chinese Australian, Italian Australian, Indigenous Australian. We should all be Australian and celebrate and recognise what we are as a nation.
Dr. Donnelly, do you consider Alan as assimilated?
Well, I've worked a lot with Koori in Victoria, and I've been to Central Australia, Docker River, Ernabella, remote communities of Indigenous people. And the people I speak to, like Noel Pearson in Cape York, they argue, in fact, that we are Australian. That doesn't deny that we have our own ancestry, our own culture, if you like. But as a federal politician said some years ago, all people who live in Australia should recognise Australian values, our heritage, and should abide by our Australian laws. And I think that's only a reasonable thing to expect.
Alan, final word from you, please. We're out of time. 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, Kevin's views are completely outdated and, are really out of step with modern society, and, glosses over the fact that that intergenerational trauma still exists today. And, it's great hearing from privileged white men who have never experienced the aftermath of colonization. He doesn't, live with the fear a lot of my family does, or I live with, in regards to just, surviving every day. I mean, I grew up in a very small town in Bourke, and I can tell you now that this harmonious Australia Kevin's talking about, it just doesn't exist because, first of all, we need to acknowledge our racism and we need to be more inclusive of our First Nations people and face our ugly past. And so I won't be lectured to on about, what the Aboriginal community should and shouldn't be doing from someone who has absolutely nothing to do with it.
Okay, unfortunately, gentlemen, I've got to wrap. It's been a privilege giving both of you a platform to allow your ideas to crash into each other a little bit. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Massive military parades are descending on the streets of India for its Republic Day. It honours the date the Constitution came into effect, replacing British law. But one place that's got the military without the celebrations is Indian-administered Kashmir. The past year has seen intensified violence in the divided region, and many Kashmiris call January 26th a black day. They say they are denied their democratic rights that should be ensured under India's constitution. Randolph Nogel reports.
A national tribute honoring India's constitution. But to the north, in Indian-administered Kashmir, where a ground-to-air security operation is underway, Republic Day has another name, Black Day, in the only state in India that's predominantly Muslim, and where many consider their land occupied. The decades-old conflict heated up again last summer after Indian security forces killed separatist rebel leader Burhan Wadi. His death sparked a series of street protests calling for independence, which were met with a crackdown by Indian security forces. India, which accuses Pakistan of supporting separatist groups, says it launched a strike along the line of control against rebel targets in retribution for an attack in September, in which 19 Indian soldiers were killed. Pakistan disputes the strike, but skirmishes and rising tensions on the border between the two nuclear-armed countries have caused alarm in the region and across the world. Pakistan has increasingly called on India to administer an independence referendum in its province. And Amnesty International has accused Indian security forces of abusing sweeping powers to search, arrest, or shoot people given to them under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. But Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said he's not willing to compromise on national security and has placed the blame squarely on Pakistan.
India alone cannot walk the path of peace. It also has to be Pakistan's journey to make.
The Kashmir issue has been a rallying point for hardliners who support Modi's crackdown on dissent.
These 4 photos of Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi, and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, as a group through which we want to send a message that there is a rise of right-wing leaders in the world, and Islamic extremists should either disappear or this group will finish them.
While India's Republic Day is meant to celebrate unity and diversity, in Kashmir, many are united by the desire to be governed by a republic of their own. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New Delhi is Nalin Kohli. He's the spokesman for the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. And from Srinagar in Indian-administered Kashmir is Shujat Bukhari, editor-in-chief of the newspaper Rising Kashmir. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Shujat, let me ask you, is Republic Day a day of celebration for all Indians?
Yes, certainly. Republic Day is actually a day of celebration for the entire India because India became democratic on 26th of January 1950. But as far as Kashmir is concerned, for the last more than 26 years, this day is not being celebrated on the scale that it is being celebrated in the rest of India because of the fact that people here have been calling for the resolution of Kashmir dispute, and they believe that they have been cheated right from 1947. Their promises have not been fulfilled, which were made to them from time to time. And not only that, but whatever autonomy the state of Jammu and Kashmir had got under the Indian constitution was clandestinely eroded from time to time, and people were thrust from Delhi on people of Kashmir. And when in 1987, people reposed faith in the Indian democracy, the elections were rigged at large scale, and that actually became a turning point in the history of Jammu and Kashmir.
Shujat, I don't want to go through the whole timeline, but what is clear is that the situation is tense in Jammu and Kashmir and different to much of the rest of the country on this auspicious day. Let me pose that to Nalin, you're a spokesman for the ruling party. Does that take the gloss away from the celebrations across the country that Kashmir is so tense and so unresolved?
No, I don't think it's only about Jammu and Kashmir. As you know, the state of Jammu and Kashmir has three parts to it. It has the part of Jammu, it has the part of Kashmir Valley, and it has the part of Ladakh. So broadly, you would see a lot of happiness there. In Jammu, in the state, a particular valley part of Kashmir, our viewpoint is that it's really been vitiated because of the cross-border terrorism that comes from Pakistan, and backed by trying to create some kind of an Islamist ideology behind it. And that has resulted in a lot of bloodshed, and therefore it has called for the necessity or necessitated the presence, a larger presence of security forces and the armed forces. So I think if you look at even in elections, there has been, the last election itself has been seen as a very good example of a free and fair election. So yes, there are problems, there's no doubt about it, because everyone aspires to be in complete peace. We all do, and that does not exclude others in the state.
You mentioned the elections. The last election had lower voter turnout than ever before. Do you have any sympathy for those Kashmiris? Let's take the militants and put them aside.
I think you've got the figure wrong. The last election had among the highest voter turnouts. You might want...
I'm just looking at a piece in The Diplomat that's quoting that. Okay, so I stand to be corrected if I've got that wrong. I've got a piece in The Diplomat that's got that. However, do you have any sympathy for those Kashmiris, taking the militants, putting them aside, those Kashmiris who are innocent Kashmiris who want to protest against the lockdowns and the curfews and so on? Do you have any sympathy for them calling this a black day and not Republic Day?
Look, there's not a question of sympathy. Every Indian, and that includes every Indian, including those who reside in Jammu and Kashmir and particularly in the Kashmir Valley, is entitled to aspire for peace. And if there is a protest in a peaceful manner, that's the strength of the Indian Constitution. Please bear in mind that the Indian Constitution is a document of shared values. It's not about identity, but shared values, and that's what brings so many diverse people together. So therefore, aspirations have to be part of that. So if there's a protest also, that is also under the Constitution permitted. One can express their view, but everything is within a certain framework. You can't propagate violence. If you take law and order in your own hands, then obviously then the state mechanism, the other security mechanisms are forced to step in. Okay. That's not a question by choice or preference.
Sure, let's get a response from Shujat then. Shujat, this Indian Constitution is a document of shared values that applies to people who live in Jammu and Kashmir as well. What do you think?
No, I don't think so. That's what I said at the outset, that Indian Constitution has failed in the sense right from 1947. That's what I say, that the promises which had been made to the people of Jammu and Kashmir were not fulfilled, and that should have been the spirit of the democracy and spirit of Constitution. And as far as the protests are concerned and other things are concerned, you have seen that in 2016, Kashmir was locked down for 5 months. I mean, for 50 days, you had to put curfew and you had to put 7 million people in a lockdown. So, I mean, there's a political problem on the ground. It's not all what we say that is sponsored by Pakistan, aided and abetted by them. Yes, Pakistan is party to it, but entire Kashmir is actually has been on streets. I mean, they have their political aspirations. I mean, they have not been fulfilled. I mean, they are not even being, that's not being recognized on the ground. I mean, there's no acknowledgement that there's a political problem. I mean, look at Kashmir, it's the highest militarized zone today. So if, I mean, even in spite of having so much of the military, so much of paramilitary forces, I mean, people are not celebrating the Republic Day. I mean, what does that mean here? I mean, that's a very important question. Let us not actually just brush it aside as something which has come from Pakistan directly. I mean, I said that, I mean, there is a Pakistani angle, there's no doubt about it, but the question is that largely, whatever people have been saying for the last so many years, essentially in 2010, in 2016, I think that's a big political statement. My worry is that with the passage of time, the people have been rallying behind the militants again. The path they had actually left in after mid-90s, and they wanted to give peace a chance, and there was transition from violence to non-violence. But unfortunately, that was not capitalized, and there was no dialogue going on.
Okay, we are running out of time. Nalin, I want to pose to you something that was said by the Opposition Congress President Sonia Gandhi. She said the intrinsic strength of the Indian Republic lies in our constitutional values, and she asked the people to, quote, fight forces which seek to undermine them. This, in my reading, is clearly a dig, a poke at the BJP. She's implying that you're not living up to the Constitution.
No, there's nothing to be implied.
Is that fair?
It's absolutely directly a poke. Yes, of course, it's a poke at the BJP. And of course, in that poke, three fingers, when you point our finger one way, you have three pointing yourself. So if at all there are any problems in the country, the Congress has gloriously misruled this country for 55 years out of the 70 years. So even if you're looking at the problems in Jammu and Kashmir, you need to acknowledge that it has taken Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru right up to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, 55 years of that, to bring about those problems. So I think that's a very good comment. Those divisive forces lie probably in her party. She would do well to identify them, rather than constantly looking outside. That's the standard phenomena across the world through history, from Bismarck right up to Pakistan, that find a fault outside your own faults. If you recognize faults, you'll find solutions.
Okay, Nalin Kohli and Shujat Bukhari. I wish we had more time, but we don't. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Gupta. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.